So ever since ChatGPT just exploded onto the scene, it's completely turned the whole conversation about education on its head. I mean, all of a sudden, this incredibly powerful AI is in the hands of millions of students and millions of teachers, and it's kicking up this huge storm of both excitement and, yeah, some pretty serious concern. So today we're going to cut through all that noise. We're going to look at the hype versus the reality of AI in the classroom.
Now, check out this quote. "The biggest risk is doing nothing." You might think that's from some tech company's flashy ad, right? Nope. That's actually the title of a UK government report looking at the very first schools to bring AI into their classrooms. And that sends a pretty clear message, doesn't it? Ignoring this stuff, well, it's just not an option anymore. This is really a story about being careful for sure, but also about making a change that's absolutely necessary.
All right, Section 1. AI's promise for schools. Let's dive into the potential here and see how it could really transform things for teachers and students.
So when you boil it all down, the massive appeal of AI for schools really comes down to two huge promises. First, and this is a big one, is the idea that it can radically, and I mean radically, reduce the insane workload that teachers are under. And second, to finally make good on this dream of personalized learning for every single student. You know, at the end of the day, it's all about freeing up teachers to do what they do best: teach.
And look, this isn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea. A recent trial actually put this to the test. They found that teachers using ChatGPT saved, get this, 31% of their time on things like lesson planning and admin work. 31%. That's a real, concrete number that translates directly into more time with students and, let's be honest, a lot less burnout. So yeah, the efficiency gains are totally real and you can actually measure them.
But you know, it's not just about saving time. AI is being used in these really profoundly human ways. It's actually delivering on that promise of personalization. We're talking about schools that are the first to jump in. And what are they doing? They're using AI to translate resources for refugee children. They're creating little podcasts of lessons for young carers who have to miss class. They're adapting materials for students with special needs. It's really about leveling the playing field for everyone.
Okay, so all of this sounds pretty incredible, right? It almost sounds like a silver bullet for some of the biggest problems in education. But, and you knew there was a but coming, as these trailblazing schools are finding out, for every single one of these amazing promises, there's a serious risk lurking just under the surface. It turns out bringing AI into the classroom, yeah, it's anything but simple.
In this slide, this really lays out the central conflict perfectly. For every piece of hype, there's a dose of reality. You've got the promise on one side and the peril on the other. So you see something amazing like reduced workload, but the flip side is the risk of de-skilling teachers. Or personalized learning, which sounds fantastic but could lead to an illusion of learning. It's the very things that make AI so exciting that also bring these huge risks. It's like walking a tightrope, and schools are right in the middle of it.
Okay, Section 2, the hurdles and headaches. So let's talk about the tough stuff. Let's really dig into the risks of this new technology. So get this, even among the teachers who are already using AI, the data shows there's this real sense of unease. A staggering 64%, that's almost 2/3, say they just don't feel like they know enough about it to use it well. And on top of that, you've got more than 1/3 who are really worried about the risks, things like privacy and bias, so there's definitely excitement, but it's being held back by this major knowledge gap.
And maybe the biggest fear from an academic standpoint is this idea of the illusion of learning. So what does that mean? Well, the worry is that if students start relying too much on AI to just spit out answers or write their essays for them, they'll get really good at producing work, but they'll get worse at the skills that really matter. You know, that deep, critical thinking, the problem solving, the stuff that education is actually for. They could be handing in more stuff, but understanding way less.
And then there's this. This is a pretty sobering reality check from the academic world. So, despite all the buzz, all the excitement, researchers looked at not one or two, but 143 different studies. And their conclusion? It was pretty blunt. They said there is just no conclusive, reliable evidence yet that AI actually makes students learn better. We can measure how much time a teacher saves, sure, but we can't yet measure if a student is actually gaining more knowledge. That's a huge question mark.
And here's the kicker. While all the adults, the schools, the researchers are debating all this, you know who's not waiting around? The students. The number of teenagers using this stuff more than doubled in just 1 year. It went from 37% all the way up to 77%. This isn't some problem for the future. It is happening right now, today, and schools are basically in a mad dash to try and catch up.
So, with all these risks, how are some schools actually making this work?
Let's jump into Section 3, the Early Adopters Playbook, and see how these pioneers are building the future safely.
Okay, so the first thing, and honestly, this might be the most important piece of the whole puzzle, is a human. The schools that are getting this right almost always have what the report calls an AI champion. And no, this isn't just the IT person down the hall. It's usually a passionate teacher, someone who gets the tech, but, and this is key, also gets the classroom. They're the bridge between those two worlds.
And this quote here from a digital lead just nails why that role is so crucial. They said, what you really need is someone with leadership responsibility who can speak human as well rather than techie. And that's it right there. You need someone who has the authority, who knows the tech but can explain it to everybody else. They speak human, not techie. They're the ones who make it less scary, who answer the tough questions, and who build that confidence from the ground up.
Now, this is a brilliant strategy for handling risk. It's called a pre-mortem, and one school actually did this. So check this out. Before they even started their AI project, they got the whole team together in a room and said, okay, let's imagine it's a year from now and this thing has failed. It's been a complete disaster. And then they worked backwards. They made a list of every single reason why it might have failed. You know, students cheating, kids seeing inappropriate stuff, you name it. And then they built their entire plan specifically to stop those exact things from happening. How smart is that? It's all about getting ahead of the problems before they even start.
All right, so that's the big picture strategy. Let's move on to Section 4 and put AI into practice. We're going to look at how this stuff is actually being used, from planning lessons to personalizing them.
So you can basically break down the tools they're using into two main buckets. First, you've got your teacher-facing tools. Think of these as the behind-the-scenes helpers. They're all about cutting down that teacher workload, helping with lesson plans, making quizzes, stuff like that. And then you've got the pupil-facing tools. These are the ones the students actually interact with, like a custom chatbot for help or a tool that gives them instant feedback on their assignments.
And this is where we see that promise of personalization really come to life. Remember we talked about this a minute ago? This is what it actually looks like in a real classroom. Teachers translating materials into Arabic for Syrian refugee students, making 10-minute lesson podcasts for young carers who might have missed school, instantly changing a worksheet for a pupil with special educational needs. I mean, this is where the technology stops being just a tool and starts becoming genuinely transformative.
And get this, the really savvy teachers, they're actually turning AI's mistakes into teachable moments. There's this one great example where a teacher asked an AI to create images of a doctor. It came back with 5 pictures. Every single one was a white man. And a couple of the kids immediately said, hey, there are no women here. There's no one that looks like me. Instead of just ignoring it, the teacher leaned right in. They used it to have a real, critical conversation about bias. That's teaching digital literacy by showing what it means, not just telling them.
Okay, so we've seen the hype, the headaches, and the playbook from the pioneers. For our final section, let's look at the road ahead and try to navigate the unwritten chapter of AI in education. So what's the biggest challenge that's left? Well, if you ask the early adopters themselves, they'll tell you it's moving beyond this kind of Wild West phase of just trying stuff out. Most of them will admit, yeah, we have a vision, we see the potential, but they don't have a real long-term strategy for weaving AI into the very fabric of how they teach. They're still trying to figure out the how.
And that connects directly to another huge gap, evaluation. Remember how we said there's no hard evidence yet? Well, schools are feeling that. They're finding it incredibly difficult to actually measure if AI is making a difference to student learning. They can get feedback from teachers, asking, did you find this helpful? But they're missing the hard data that proves students are actually learning more. And without those clear numbers, it's almost impossible to separate what's just hype from what's genuinely helpful.
And that really brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of all. The potential here is obviously massive. We've seen that, but the path forward is still pretty blurry. So as this technology just keeps getting more and more powerful, the big question is, how do we make sure that the technology is serving learning and not the other way around?